Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is David Klion. Dave, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm a contributing editor at Jewish Currents, a columnist for The Nation. I write for a lot of places. I'm at work on a book for Doubleday about the legacy of neoconservatism. And I also go way back with Aryeh because, over a decade ago, we were both editors for the website Blogging Heads, working for Robert Wright. And so we've been podcasting or blogging heads or whatever for a very long time, actually.
Yes. So welcome back on the show. You've been on a couple times before, though not in a number of years. And yeah, I was an editor at Blogging Heads, and maybe we'll cut this, but I was an editor at Blogging Heads, and you started as a freelancer. And I think I was the one who said, "Yeah, let's take this guy." Although I honestly, it's been so long ago that I can't remember. So it's
You
possible I
changed my
launched
life,
you.
Arya.
I
It's
launched you
possible.
into the
It's possible
stratosphere.
Arya is the one to blame for me, Arya and Bob. But yeah,
But we are not primarily, strolling down memory lane in this episode. We're going to be talking mainly about a piece you wrote about Jeffrey Epstein, and then also about Blue Sky versus Twitter/X, the Everything app. You sort of became a main character of the day on Blue Sky a week or so ago. But let's start with this piece you wrote. The link will be in the show notes. So it's for Jewish Currents. The headline is "The Line Between Affinity and Conspiracy." Subhead: Epstein relied on Jewish in-group bonds to cultivate the network that facilitated his crimes.
yeah.
So can you give us a rundown of your argument in this piece?
Sure. Well, first, I just want to say where the piece came from. It was commissioned by the editor-in-chief at Jewish Currents, Ariel Angel, who I've worked with for years. And Jewish Currents, for any listeners not familiar, is a left-wing Jewish publication with very exacting editorial standards that has been around technically since the 1940s, was revived in 2017 or 18 by a group of millennials. It had sort of been as almost like a zine for a little while, and has gone on to, I think, a certain amount of niche literary prestige and intellectual prestige in the last few years, which I've had a small part in. I'm certainly not the main one behind it. But so I think of it as, among other things, the perfect place for an article like this, because, well, Jewish is right there in the name, and nearly everybody involved in it is Jewish, including every editor who worked on it and me, which means that it's a space where I think we can talk honestly about sometimes uncomfortable topics involving Jews, and honestly and responsibly, but also take some risks and not just be afraid of our own shadows, which I think a lot of public-facing Jewish discourse often is.
Mhm.
So in this particular case, I think the thinking behind the piece was, there's always been a sort of an anti-Semitic subtext to the Jeffrey Epstein story, but as that story has taken on the scope it now has, with millions of emails released by the Trump administration and so on, and in the current climate, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and rhetoric are just running absolutely rampant around this story. And there is you can't put that genie back in the bottle, really. There's no way to just be like, let's all just condemn this unequivocally and it'll go away. And people, we'll call the refs, and the refs will say, this is anti-Semitism, so you shouldn't do it. And that's it. And we'll shame anyone, Tucker Carlson or whoever, who plays that game out of the discourse. That is so not the world we live in, if it ever was. Maybe it was for a little while, but
Yeah, maybe 15 or 20 years ago,
yeah,
something like that could have worked. But
maybe even less than that. But it certainly doesn't work now,
yeah.
right? It doesn't work now. You have for a confluence of reasons. You have Donald Trump and this sort of ascendant right-wing conspiratorial, openly bigoted culture. You have this backlash against woke that is so thorough and sweeping that there are many people on the left who are sympathetic to at least parts of it. You have, without getting too carried away on this topic, you have the Gazan genocide, and now this war in Iran, which Israel and the U.S. both openly say Israel is, essentially involved in starting. And in this climate, I think two things are true. First, anti-Semites have a field day, right? I mean, the world is in so many ways conforming to their kind of sick, twisted image of it, right? I mean, there are clearly powerful Jews starting wars. There are clearly powerful Jews who were involved in systematic, pedophile slave trafficking or whatever you want to call it. There are clearly a lot of bad Jews in the world, to use the title of my friend Emily Tamkin's book, thoughtful book on this subject. Well, kind of this subject. So their horrifying worldview is being confirmed, which is quite scary for Jews like you or me who, are caught up in that. We're assumed to be, I mean, rising anti-Semitism is obviously not good for us. It's not good for any Jews. That's not very complicated. And at the same time, I think it's not just like an unfortunate coincidence that anti-Semites have all this ammunition. It reflects the fact that there really are a lot of powerful bad Jews in the world who really are doing these things. And their Jewishness is not incidental. It's central to how they see themselves and how they've operated in the world. And I think as Jews, we don't have the luxury of not talking about this and asking other people not to talk about it anymore. I think it is simply the reality now, and that in fact the more responsible thing to do is to tackle it head on, honestly, to describe what everyone can see, to use facts and rational arguments. And I don't expect to persuade anti-Semites. Anti-Semites are going to be anti-Semites no matter what. But I think there are a lot of people right now who are confused, horrified by various things happening in the world, and open to especially some of the more veiled anti-Semitic rhetoric, or to finding common cause with anti-Semites. Now, Jewish currents on the subject of Gaza, which has been maybe the biggest impetus for this, and the Israeli war on the Palestinians more generally over decades, Jewish currents has a lot of credibility here because we've been calling out Israel and the American Jewish establishment, consistently and rigorously for years. So I think we, and as Jews, and we've called it out often from a position of like, this is a disaster for Jews that our institutions are corrupted by this fascist genocidal apartheid state, which is, what I sincerely believe, and what a lot of Jews on the left sincerely believe. So we're not afraid to criticize Jewish institutions, and we're not afraid, and Jewish leaders, and we're not afraid to criticize them as Jews. I mean, to make explicitly clear that the people we are criticizing are Jews, and that matters. And we understand that, some of the people who glom on to the pro-Palestine movement may in fact be anti-Semites in their heart of hearts. Speaking for myself, I understand that. I don't think it's that many, but if you are an anti-Semite, it certainly does create a space in which you can operate if you calibrate your rhetoric correctly. But I think that the fact that that's possible doesn't mean like you can't criticize Israel or that you have to like tiptoe around it and criticize it very carefully. So I essentially extended the same logic, and I think Jewish Currents extended the same logic to the Epstein story. It's not just that Jeffrey Epstein was Jewish. It's that if you start looking into it, enormous numbers of people, in fact, I would say, going by the New York Times account, which I discussed in the piece, the overwhelming majority of people involved in his rise from obscurity to a position where he could interact with world-famous Gentiles like Bill Clinton were Jews. And not just were Jews, but like the whole trajectory of his rise parallels in a lot of ways I've been studying, including for my book, the sort of mid to late 20th century rise of American Jews, or of a certain type of American Jewish man in particular. And my view is that by trying to contextualize his story as a Jewish story and not being afraid to discuss it as one, we can provide some clarity. In some ways, we can demystify it. We can make it seem less conspiratorial and more a reflection of some broader an ugly reflection of some broader trends in our society. We can make it more intelligible. We can push back against some of the really nasty excesses of the conspiracy theories around it. And at the same time, we can hold various important Jews and Jewish institutions accountable. So that was the basic thinking behind this piece.
Well, I encourage people to read it. And again, the link will be in the show notes. I mean, where should I go with this? You obviously knew you were going to get some amount of blowback from this piece running about it because you're stepping on various, not third rails exactly, but I mean, in a way, you are, the charge would be the classic Chandra for the Goyim, like you're airing the dirty laundry in front of the rest of the world. And, Jewish Currents is a Jewish leftist magazine, but it's online. And so, things break containment would be one term for it very easily. And
well, to that point, I'll just say, I don't think Jewish Currents intends to only be read by Jews, and neither do I. I think, I'm sure a very large portion of the audience is Jewish, but no, these are written for a general public with all the risks that entails. It's not meant to be a whispered insider conversation.
Right. And you also have, what this made me think of is getting back to maybe my topic I've discussed most on this podcast, which is Philip Roth, when his early short stories that portray Jewish characters in a negative light, in like late 50s, famously, a prominent rabbi wrote him a letter saying, you are completing Hitler's work for this short story where, especially there's one where it's about a army private, someone higher up in the basic training is Jewish, and then there's a private who comes in who's Jewish, who's a malingerer, and he uses the bond between Jews to get out of doing, like cleaning the kitchen or whatever he wants to do, and the guy lets him get away with it. The narrator, who's Jewish, Jewish captain or whatever, lets him get away with it at first, but then realizes like, oh, this guy is like taking advantage of Jewish clandestineness, which is part of the piece, and this sparked an uproar against Roth. And the story is told that the rabbi who was afraid of creating anti-Semitism looks somewhat quaint, and Philip Roth became one of the great writers of the 20th century. So there's that objection.
To cite another, I've brought up, I did a podcast like a week ago with Wajahat Ali where we discussed this piece, and I actually brought up that Roth example independently. So it's definitely been on my mind.
Yeah.
And I'll bring up another example from your native Newark or greater Newark area that does not involve Jews, which is The Sopranos, which, is a show by an Italian-American creator with an overwhelmingly Italian-American cast that portrays Italian-Americans in a not entirely flattering light.
Right.
And not only got actual pushback from like the Italian-American Anti-Defamation League or whatever, but writes that pushback into the show and satirizes it. And look, like, I'm not going to compare myself in a serious way to David Chase or to Philip Roth, and obviously I'm writing nonfiction for one thing, but ultimately, like, who are we going to remember? Those guys and the indelible stories they told about their community and all its flaws and humanity, or these losers who whined about it? Like, that is kind of how I feel. Like, I understand the sensitivities here, but I'm sorry, like, putting aside the immediate urgent crisis that there's going to be anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Epstein and Israel and everything else, whether I write a piece like this or not. Putting that aside, I just think at a basic, like, creative or humanistic level, like, stop being wusses, like you need to be able to tell stories from our community and their complexity. And I would say this for any other demographic that exists. I mean, I understand, though I could push back against some of the woke sensitivities around, say, like, I don't know, a white person writing a black character and, having to do that sensitively or whatever. But that's not even what we're talking about here. We're talking about writing about one's own community and not acting like you have to be like perfect, upstanding model minority and shut down any discourse to the contrary. I mean, what struck me about, so there was this Times piece that came out in December. It's a very good piece. I have no quarrel with it. Very, very long piece about Epstein and how he got his wealth, deeply reported. And I cited in my piece, and in the piece, it it names all these people who get Jeffrey Epstein from like lower middle class Coney Island to the Upper East Side, and going through Bear Stearns and all these networks, and it actually like shows you graphics like mapping out this person introduced into this person. And I counted like, I don't know, 17 names in this piece that weren't Bill Clinton or whatever. They're all Jews. I like Googled them all to confirm they're all Jews. I'm not just going off of what the names sound like. But the Times never mentions that, ever. And I'm not saying it should have. I understand, the Times is doing this as straight reporting. They're trying to pick apart conspiracies, and they're trying to be as responsible as possible. But I was like, I'm going to name that. I'm going to say, the Times gently steps around this, but actually it's kind of the story, right? This Jewish guy went to Bear Stearns, the Wall Street investment firm, which famously collapsed at the start of the 2008 financial crisis, was around for almost 100 years before that. It was founded by two Jews, Bear and Stearns. It was always one of the Jewish firms during a long period when, most Wall Street banks discriminated against Jews and were kind of run by WASP, blue blood types. It had this kind of scrappy underdog thing going on. It liked to get people like Epstein, who were Jews, but also just kind of from the provinces, as it were, and give them a leg up in the world. And from like the 1960s, 70s, 80s, that's happening with a whole lot of Jews of a certain age, in finance, but also in media and politics, and many other realms, and the Ivy League, and many other realms of achievement. And so I see Epstein as fundamentally part of that story, and I see that story as being pretty effectively conveyed by the Times piece, but without anyone ever, mentioning the elephant in the room. So I mentioned the elephant in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And I think understanding it in those terms, to a certain extent, does indict not certainly every Jew on earth or the abstract idea of Judaism, or even most Jews on earth, but I think maybe it does indict something about Jewish culture, Jewish public-facing institutions, Jewish networking, Jewish clannishness, which is not a uniquely Jewish feature, but it certainly is a Jewish feature, and one anti-Semites have often made hay of. At the same time, I think it normalizes this story in certain ways, because, in order to do this, I ended up reading through a bunch of emails. I looked for certain keywords and certain names. I obviously didn't read all of the millions of emails that exist, but I read some hundreds or whatever. And, his correspondences with people like Marty Peretz, the former editor and publisher of The New Republic, who the piece starts with. And when I read those, I often found, like, I think people assume the Epstein emails are all like, let's do pedophile crimes together, right? Because some of them that, have gotten a lot of attention do sometimes read that way. Certainly not the one Peretz did, but like there are emails he has with people that are certainly suggestive of that dynamic, not always with Jewish people by any means. And then I think if you were to show someone who wasn't particularly like savvy or familiar with the world of like moneyed New York Jews or whatever, if you were to show them emails that don't even say that, they might just be like, oh, this is very like winky and friendly and familiar, and clearly there's a conspiracy here. Well, without letting anyone off the hook, because I don't think anyone who was emailing Jeffrey Epstein, certainly after his first prison bid in 2008, 2010, I don't think anyone who's emailing him comes off very well, unless they were like a journalist or a fact checker or something. In reading these, honestly, what came across to me, they're gross, obviously. The whole thing is really gross. But some of it was kind of familiar. Like, oh, these are just a bunch of old Jewish men of the same social class kind of shooting the shit, or in some cases hitting each other up for favors or money. I mean, that's what Peretz was doing. He was asking Epstein, he and Bill Ackman were asking Epstein to give money to YIVO, the Jewish Cultural Center, which in and of itself is a perfectly worthy cause. So like, I read those and I'm like, well, in a way, Jewish clannishness and networking, like the story here isn't, oh, all the Jews are involved in a giant pedophile conspiracy that controls the world and on behalf of Israel or whatever insane thing Candace Owens is saying this week. The actual story is there's this grifter guy, Jeffrey Epstein, who was a pedophile and systematized that using vast amounts of wealth that he got by networking his way up through largely Jewish wealthy circles and sort of charming and cajoling and also lying to people and manipulating people. Along the way, I think he found some like-minded people who liked to participate in pedophile crimes with him. And some of those people turned out to be very rich and powerful. Some of them are not Jewish. I'm going to refrain from naming people who definitively would have participated in it because, I don't want you to get sued or anything.
Right. Well,
but,
I mean,
but I believe there are some.
The most famous person directly implicated in the sex crimes themselves is former Prince Andrew.
Sure.
Can't get more goyish than that. So.
Can't get more goyish than that. Now, if you look a little closer, you'll see that he was actually introduced. I forget the guy's name, but like the go-between who connected him to Epstein was a Jewish guy in Britain.
I did notice that in a recent. Yeah, there was a piece about that shadowy financier figure.
But like on some level, the story is like a little more banal. I mean, it's hard to say Jeffrey Epstein is banal, and I want to be clear, I'm not a mutual friend of the podcast, Michael Tracy here, acting like there's just nothing to see, like no one did anything wrong. I don't believe that. I think that Jeffrey Epstein was a monstrous criminal, and I believe that many of the people involved were also monstrous criminals. And then beyond that, I think there's a whole social universe that just kind of didn't care, and was just like, oh yeah, that guy has money. That guy throws parties where I can meet Mick Jagger and Bill Clinton. That guy can give money to my pet cause. I feel important hanging around him. So what? So he solicited a teen prostitute and did a brief jail bid for it. Like, that's not my business. I suspect that's what the vast majority of people in the Epstein emails, that was their basic worldview. And reading the emails has actually more convinced me that that is the case, as opposed to just a hunch. Like, you read them and you're like, oh, like these are actually the boring kinds of emails that rich, amoral people send each other, So like in the Parrots case, like he's raising for YIVO, and actually there's a very telling detail. Part of me wishes I could have rewritten the first paragraph a little bit to include this, though I don't think it's misleading, but I think it adds a little texture. So the opening line of the piece is, I am glad you are back among the free, which is what Parrots writes in this email, where he then goes on to ask Jeffrey Epstein to give money to YIVO. And I explain all that. But there's another detail in the email that Parrots sent. I could have done a fuller quote than that, where before he gets to like, I'm glad you're back among the free, he says like, Jeffrey, we've met a few times at this or that, rich Jewish person's party. I forget who, but he mentioned some interesting names. Like, we met, in this year and that year, and I don't know if you remember me, but I'm really sorry I haven't reached out lately. I meant to, and then it just kind of slipped my mind, but I'm glad you're back among the free, right? So if you read this carefully, and as you know, I'm not except in an ironic sense, I'm not a fan of Marty Parrots, and I'm not here to defend his various sordid legacies. But if you read that carefully, I think and you read between the lines, I think what he's really saying there is, hey, Jeff, we've met once or twice in the kind of rich Jewish person settings where guys like us would be politely introduced to each other. I actually don't give a shit about you at all. You went to jail and I didn't write you, because why the fuck was I going to write you while you were in jail? I barely know you, and also it sounds like you're a bad person. But now you're out of jail, and I want you to give some money to YIVO, so I'm going to send this obsequious email. I mean, that's really what this is, right? Like, that he's basically acknowledging that, and that's also, if you live in New York or any financial capital for long enough, you know that hopefully not the sex crime part, but like the rest of this is kind of how the world works. People sending each other insincere, obsequious emails all the time, trying to get things out of each other, right? Mm-hmm. And understanding that like amoral rich guys are just part of how this place works. And maybe some of them have done some questionable sex things before, and you don't think about that too hard. I'm not trying to speak for myself here as far as this attitude, as more as I just kind of think it's a very common attitude for people to have. Parrots, as I note in the piece, was gay. I think it's highly unlikely he wanted to participate in any of this stuff. I don't even get the sense, going on with more emails, he was ever particularly close with Epstein. He did write stuff like that to him again and tried to get him to go to parties and whatever. But like, it's like, when you read it that way, you realize, okay, on the one hand, this is not that exciting. On the other hand, it's kind of damning of the general culture of like the sort of like risen super rich Jewish class at that generation. Maybe not exclusively of them as Jews, but there is a particular culture, I think.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot there. I mean, it's unclear, like, how much of an open secret slash what did people actually know about what Epstein was up to. So they knew he went to prison, although he had this very sweetheart deal. So, if you vaguely knew Jeffrey Epstein and heard he went to jail for prostitution, but also that they let him,
With a minor, importantly with a minor.
right.
Yeah.
And of course that was like fabricated, like that wasn't what actually happened, but that's what he pled to. But also that, they're letting him go into the office every day, and on weekends he has visitors or whatever sort of bizarre sweetheart deal he got. Then maybe you're thinking, well, I guess old Jeffrey got caught with his pants down, but
Right.
this wasn't that bad. Yeah, so
Right.
it's just like,
It's also
did
like,
people widely know that he had this whole network and that he was abusing multiple teenagers every day? That's still unclear to me. Probably not, or that story would have come
I don't
out,
think
right?
most people would have known that, though obviously people did. Some people must have known it. And also, I think a lot of people knew that he, surrounded himself with,
Right.
let's say,
So
barely legal women.
yeah, so it was like, this
that
guy is a rich creep. Like,
Yeah,
maybe everyone
I
sort of
think
knew
everyone
that.
knew he was a rich creep,
Right.
and
And there's
and a lot of guys thought that was cool. And here I also think, from a sort of a cultural angle, without excusing literally anything, it's worth recalling, as people our age. I mean, we're old enough to remember this clearly. Like, what was American culture like in like the early aughts and even into the early 20 teens, right? Like, you remember Girls Gone Wild. You remember all these websites like counting down to when this or that pop star is of legal age. You remember like if you had told me that any particular rich guy, you know, flies around on a private jet with teenage girls who may or may not be over the legal age of consent. If you were to have told me that in 2004, I don't think I would have been terribly surprised. I don't think I would have said, I'm fine with that and that's great. But I think I would have been like, yeah, that's like what rich guys do, right? And knowing that that's kind of how, I mean, this is all, way before me too. And so knowing that that's kind of how things worked back then, or at least sort of just like in the air, which was a terrible thing.
yeah.
Knowing that it was, I've always found aspects of this story kind of weirdly believable. Like, it just like, was this a secretive cabal pedophile trafficking network, or was this just like rich guys can do whatever they want, and some rich guys wanted to screw teenage girls and
Yeah.
thought no one would ever hold them accountable for
What
it.
you're making me think of is the Access Hollywood tape, and that Trump was just
Yeah.
shooting the shit with Billy Bush and was like, "Oh, that woman over there. I tried to make a move on her. I wanted to go furniture shopping with her. She shut me down. But you got to grab him by the pussy, and
Right.
if you're a star, they let you do it."
When
So that's
when we were in college, fucking
that's
Tucker
sort of loose
Max was a
talk.
thing.
Like,
Remember,
powerful men were
you remember
doing it.
Tucker Max?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, like the culture was just like proud, boorish misogyny and and creepiness. Like that was all out in the open back then. And I feel like Jeffrey Epstein just embodies that.
Right. So so one objection one could raise to your piece is that, Epstein primarily was friends with and emailed with people who were more or less like him, which was, men, largely Jewish men in their 50s and 60s at positions of power who he could trade favors with. And, most people hang out with people who are more or less like them or in their social class or milieu. So Epstein's Jewishness is sort of like, as you were talking about this, I thought about the Sean Puffy Combs trial, and I'm sure other people have made the comparison, but like that was another powerful, much more public facing person who was openly, committing sex crimes that other powerful people were aware of or engaged in or something. And probably like Combs was hanging out with people who were more or less like him, which would be like, celebrity people in music and entertainment. And like, if a black person wrote a piece about like, the P. Diddy problem in the black community, that I assume a lot of people inside and out of the Black community would like get mad. But maybe that piece has
Yeah,
been written.
so I'm glad you put it as bluntly as you just did. I was about to go there anyway, but I think if a thoughtful, I hope I'm thoughtful, Black writer decided to take on directly, like what does P. Diddy's treatment of women say about, you know, a particular strain of misogyny in the Black community or the hip hop community. I would be interested to read that piece. I suspect a lot of Black people and a lot of people of other backgrounds would be interested to read that piece. I would not think that piece was. I am sure they would get pushback from people who are like, why are you making this about Black people? It's about men. It's about money. It's about power. And some of this is just the inevitable discursive churn, which we're now participating in as well. But like, I don't think a piece like that, carefully, sensitively written by a Black writer, possibly with Black editors, would be a bad idea at all. And I suspect there probably are elements to the Diddy story that are not, you know, like they don't universally reflect on all Black people, of course, but like tell you something about the particular culture of Black wealth and aspiration that Diddy represented for decades. And I would certainly never volunteer to write a piece like that myself.
Right.
I'd be an inappropriate person for it. I'm going to write about Jeffrey Epstein, but I believe someone could, and I actually would not be surprised if there is such a piece somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think that would go for, you know, I'm not saying categorically like, you know, I mean, when Patrick Radden Keefe writes about like IRA terrorists, like he's able to do so with a certain sensitivity because he's Irish, right? Irish American, but like he's able to like describe horrible things they did and also humanize them and deal with that in good faith. And then the book is there for everyone to read. And I don't read it and come away thinking like, wow, you really made Irish people seem violent, you know? Like I
Right.
learned something about the specific circumstances that led some Irish people to violence.
Right.
And that would be like, you know, I'm sure we could go on with analogies like this that aren't Jewish or that are, but you get the idea. Like,
Right. I guess the rejoinder, which I'm not embracing, would just be like, well, there's no active, you know, conspiracy movement about how Irish Republicans are, you know, puppeteering world events and eating babies and stuff like that. So,
well, not that, but you know, it's not as if there's not like you know, centuries of the English treating them as terrorists and subhumans, and right. I mean, it could play into those and of like Anglo-American culture discriminating against them. Like it could play into those stereotypes.
right.
Which,
But in the same way, you know, you brought up Sopranos, which is a great, you know, comparison of sort of like airing your a community's dirty laundry in a way that, you know, creates art or leads to more understanding or something, you know, like like the equivalent of David Chase in 1910 would not have written the equivalent of Sopranos because, you know, Italian American immigrants were being lynched. You know, it's
right.
sort of like when the group is under threat, that's that's when people are like, let's
Well,
batten down the hatches. And you know, Jews are under threat in various ways, and other Jews are threatening other groups in various ways as well. So it's just super complicated, and maybe there's no like
so
the history of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and violence like makes it, you know, there's no parallel in another group we can reach to talking about these fraud issues.
so my first response to that actually is I would say I have been and remain skeptical that American Jews, which is what I'm really concerned with here, are under like oppression or significant violent threat right now. I mean, there are obviously terrible, you know, Tree of Life was a horrible thing that happened in the last decade. Um, Sometimes there's graffiti or, you know, someone shouts something at someone else. But like, I do not in the main believe, I mean, first of all, I think the documented spikes in so-called anti-Semitism that have been reported over the last few years are so heavily formed, according to the people who collect these statistics, by pro-Palestine demonstrations and, you know, waving flags and saying things like "from the river to the sea," creating an encampment on a college campus that forces, you know, Jewish Zionist students to be confronted with criticism of Israel. I just categorically reject that is anti-Semitism, and I think the so-called spike of anti-Semitism is largely Jews complaining about that, and then when you tell them, "Are you sure that's anti-Semitism?" they say you're gaslighting them, And I just have no.
Yeah, I mean, we're not. Let's not get fully into this because that's a fraught conversation.
I don't want to get fully into it, but I
the
guess I'll
background.
just.
But there's been both. I mean, there's more. I think
There's
there's more
been.
legitimate anti-Semitism since October 7th, and claims of anti-Semitism that are maybe they're heartfelt or maybe they're cynical, intending to shut down political opponents. I mean, yesterday I read a headline that at a rally. Oh boy, where was this? I think it was someone who was running for governor of California. He started a chant that said "tax the rich," and then there was a woman in the crowd who started yelling "tax the Jews."
Yeah.
So that's it, and that's anti-Semitic.
No,
I think.
I
Would that have
actually
happened
do.
before October 7th? Who knows? It
I
probably
actually
wouldn't
do
have, or would
believe.
seem more unusual.
I think that Epstein. I think okay. So we're more than 2 years past October 7th, and the Gaza genocide has only become more and more recognized as such. So I think that has contributed to this. I think the Epstein story has contributed to it, and now I think this war with Iran, which is going to drive up everyone in America's energy prices and so on, is going to be absolutely disastrous for the Jews. And I can see that. Certainly on my social media feed, I can see that anti-Semitic rhetoric, explicitly anti-Semitic. I mean, as I say in the piece, for instance, when like Candace Owens talks about how we are ruled by the synagogue of Satan, that's anti-Semitism. That's not ambiguous. That's not criticism of Israel or whatever. That's anti-Semitism of the most classic variety. And I am seeing more stuff like that I will fully agree is anti-Semitism. Now, it still hasn't gotten to the point where I personally feel physically threatened by it. I still have yet to confront a meaningful incident in my grown life in the United States where I felt like physically threatened or discriminated against as a Jew. And I still think this is a much safer place to be a Jew than, for instance, Israel, our supposed sanctuary. But the biggest crime against Jews since the Holocaust was, as we're incessantly reminded by pro-Israel people, was committed in Israel, not in the United States.
Right. Well, and there's people who have the agenda of convincing diaspora Jews that they are not safe in the place they're in right now.
Yeah.
And so the only place where they're safe is Israel. And
I
would
strenuously
disagree
object
with that.
I
with that argument, but also
I think it's factually wrong, and I also am
Israel
morally and culturally offended.
Israel continues to exist, and a number of Jews live there, and so I think roughly half of the Jews on Earth live in Israel.
Something like it may be a little less, but sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you provided a possible pivot point for our next topic, which would be talking about your social media feed. Is there anything else you want to say about Epstein? Or maybe my last question would be like, okay, accepting your premise that there's something particularly Jewish about Epstein's life and the Epstein story, what we know about it, like what should we as Jews or as Americans like take from that? Like what's the
I think
how does that change how we think? Or
I think mostly just reflect. I mean, so what, why does it matter that they're Jewish? I mean, besides that they're constantly referring to it in the emails and joking about it and sometimes talking about Jewish supposed genetic superiority, intelligence, and sometimes saying pro-Israel stuff. I mean, all of it, or, raising money for organizations like Evo that are explicitly Jewish in their nature. I mean, that's all in there. Many more examples than I posted in this relatively short piece, and some that were there and got cut just for space. But there's any number of examples of that. But I would also put forward the Jews we're talking about. I mean, some of the Gentiles too, but the Jews we're talking about are so prominent in some cases that almost everyone who probably has someone they admire or used to admire who's caught up in this, right? So if you Woody Allen obviously has its own whole set of problems we don't have to get into here, but Woody Allen's in there, right? And a lot of people's Jewishness is defined in terms of the sort of secular intellectual landscape of his movies, including mine, even though I've been writing about, even though I wrote almost a decade ago about what's wrong with him. But nonetheless, his whole aesthetic has been an influence on me, and
so some of our faves have been implicated. As
some of our faves have been implicated.
Let's put it.
No, anyone on the left probably at some point admired Noam Chomsky and maybe admired him for the kind of labor left Jew that he is, labor left academic intellectual Jew that he is. He's obviously implicated in this. if you're, I can't imagine being this person, but there are people who like Alan Dershowitz and like the stuff he has to say about Israel and about the law, and he's obviously deeply implicated. There are people incredibly who like Larry Summers. So there are people, or take Marty Peretz. I mean, Marty Peretz, ran this massively influential magazine for 30 years that has seeded our entire media milieu with names, some of whom we like, some of whom maybe not so much.
But okay, but
Like,
also everyone in America either at one point liked or didn't like Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, and Elon Musk.
that's a perfectly fair point, but I do think if you look over the spectrum of Epstein's life and the people he was dealing with, it is a very disproportionately heavy Jewish scene, and it's a scene that implicates, I would say, some of the most towering figures in contemporary Jewish life from a variety of different walks, and many more than we've named here. I mean, it also implicates a former Labor Prime Minister of Israel,
right, Ehud Barak. Yeah, and I'm. Does anyone look for Philip Roth? Is he in there? He probably wasn't a huge emailer.
I don't think Philip Roth.
And if as I my long held not conspiracy theory, my long held theory that Donald Trump doesn't know how to use a computer probably prevented him from engaging over email with Epstein or texting with him or whatever. And so there's they photographed partying numerous times. Yeah. So we're missing some. This is not the oeuvre of what Epstein was up to, because
I'm sure more's going to come out too.
Epstein at one point claimed to Michael Wolff, I think, I was Donald Trump's best friend. So there's that. But
actually, Michael Wolff, another good example.
Right, but, Michael Wolff, whose reliability is very uncertain, I would say.
Yeah. So I would say, as far as what we should take from it, I think what we should take from it is, first of all, you can't just pretend this isn't a thing. It's a thing. You can't pretend the anti-Semites won't notice if we don't talk about it. They very much notice. We have to have a counter narrative that is sane and fact-based and rooted in a more nuanced and historically informed understanding of American Jewish life. And that's what I tried to do here. And I'm not surprised it didn't work for some people, but I got actually quite a lot of good feedback from it, and not just from the radical anti-Zionist Jewish left, but from pretty mainstream liberal, even liberal Zionist people who thought I would say the general consensus I got anywhere that wasn't Blue Sky, which we now turn to, and on Blue Sky too in a lot of cases.
You have retweeted / reskeeted some praise for your piece on Blue Sky.
There was a lot, and from not just from randos either. I'm not trying to toot my own horn here. I'm just saying lots of people, lots of smart, accomplished Jewish people read my piece and thought it was, a nuanced and careful way to deal with a very fraught topic that a lot of people would rather avoid. That was the general consensus view I got. And then there was the other wing of Blue Sky. And now let's talk about Blue Sky.
Right. Blue Sky is the Twitter knockoff clone that multiple people, hundreds, thousands, millions, it's unclear, number of people defected to over the past couple of years since Elon Musk bought Twitter. And I myself defected to a few days after the 2024 election in disgust at Musk and his role in reelecting Donald Trump. So I was once a semi-prominent, semi-obscure tweeter. I definitely use the site way too often, but I got sick of it over the years before Musk bought it, and was trying to limit my usage and recognize certain addictive tendencies in myself that interacted with the site in a way that did not lead to positive outcomes for myself. Although there were some positive outcomes that using Twitter over the years contributed to. But anyway, so I quit the site and moved to Blue Sky, and a number of other people did as well. But Twitter /X continues to exist, be much more popular, probably 100 times more popular or more than Blue Sky. And people on Blue Sky do not like the people who stayed on Twitter. People on Blue Sky call Twitter the Nazi site. And you posted something that grew out of a controversy that we don't need to get into in any detailed way. You threw down the gauntlet being like, Blue Sky, you guys suck, and you're not even that popular.
Without getting into the controversy in question, a friend of mine who is a reputable journalist at reputable publications was getting dogpiled herself on Blue Sky for things that she said. And I really just did this to stand up for her, although it also became me airing out grievances I have aired out in the past about Blue Sky.
Right. And so just a quote from your post, you say, the site is constantly hemorrhaging users, will never be relevant, and is seen as a joke across progressive media and activist circles. And you included like a traffic chart or something showing sort of a, decline in Blue Sky active users or something.
Yeah.
Over
Not the
time.
first person to share that. Not the first person to share that on Blue Sky.
Right. So you, I mean, you became the main character, as we said, on Blue Sky for a day or so. Yeah. Okay. So how are you thinking about Twitter these days? You're still on it.
Yeah.
How's it going these days? And how do you think about, Blue Sky, the upstart imitator?
I mean, my honest opinion about Twitter, like if having like a serious, nuanced conversation with someone like you is, yeah, it does suck. It always kind of sucked, and it sucks worse now than it did before in some tangible ways I can describe, some of which are actually quite boring, but like, it's harder to like the way you see, for instance, who liked your tweets or retweeted them involves a lot more like clicking around than it used to. And everything
the user experience,
the user
UX experience is content.
The user experience is objectively worse. They've like every few months or so, they come up with a new stupid way to make the user experience worse. DMing is worse than it used to be. Sharing links, not just sharing links from Twitter is famously much harder than it used to be. Sharing links to Twitter is also harder than it used to be. The whole place feels a little more walled off. It sucks. Anyone on Blue Sky who has decided to listen to this, you can know, first of all, I despise Elon Musk and probably shouldn't say out loud the fate I hope he meets. But he's a monster. I hated him before he took over Twitter. I was horrified when he did take over Twitter. I would very much like him not to be running Twitter. It would very much be my preference if he wasn't. And also, if we could somehow recreate Twitter as it was before him, somewhere else, not under his ownership. And I don't just mean recreate the mechanics of the site, but like recreate the full scale of people who were on it, and the sort of dynamics there. I would absolutely abandon X, if we're calling it that, for this new Twitter clone. With all that in mind, I mean, my basic experience on Twitter and feelings about it before Elon weren't very different from yours. I was, an influencer of some degree of prominence there in my space. I used to use it really compulsively and addictively. I had something of a reputation for that. Sometimes I got a little carried away on it and became the main character there. I have been much more conscientious about my Twitter use. I still will mouth off some there or express opinions there, and I certainly still use it to share my work. But I have calmed down a lot in the last 6 years.
Well, we've all gotten older. And,
yeah,
perhaps wiser.
And that was, 2 or 3 years before Elon took over. So I was already, there was the pandemic. I was already kind of trending in that direction towards like, if I'm going to mouth off, I'll do it in a private group chat with people I trust and not in front of potentially hundreds of thousands of people. I developed those instincts, which I think are healthy ones to have. And then Elon took over, and I was alarmed because I believe he is a white supremacist, a transphobe, a fascist, and everything else you want to call him, and an untrustworthy, buffoonish, reckless person. Like everyone else, in our general set, I signed up for Blue Sky as soon as it was available for me. It used to be you had to like get a invite code or something. Right. So I did. I followed all the people I could think of from the old site. I'm still there. I still post there. I have, I don't know, maybe about a quarter as many or a third as many followers there as I have on Twitter, which is not nothing. And articles do sometimes get traction there, and that's nice. However, as time, and also so Elon took over in late 2022, and there was this initial exodus, and then there would be like little exoduses every time he announced some terrible new idea. Mm-hmm. And then there was a huge, palpable one when Trump won election again in late 2024, where I could like literally see like, my Twitter feed fall by like 5 or 10,000 people, and my like Blue Sky feed grow by the same number in real time. Like there was like a week when that was happening, and I was like, okay, maybe this is for real. Maybe we really are all moving over to Blue Sky now. By then, I already had some annoyance with Blue Sky, but I was like, maybe if there's just like a wholesale mass exodus, it'll work.
I mean, in some ways, it's a collective action problem because the sites are functionally the same in how they work, but there's the built-in user base, and if everyone was forced to leave or something, or you've snapped your fingers and everyone left, then Blue Sky would become somewhat similar to Twitter, although maybe with different moderation standards, and like explicit Nazis would be, would be kickoff and stuff like that.
But I'll take it. Mastodon is a clunky old site I have no interest in. Blue Sky works pretty well. Threads I refuse to look at. I may be grandfathered into Facebook and Instagram, but though I never post on Facebook, but I'm not giving Mark Zuckerberg another claim on my attention. And also everything I've heard about Threads sounds unbearably lame. So I accept that if there was going to be a Elon-free Twitter clone, it's Blue Sky. It does work pretty similarly. At this point, the user experience is better in some ways than Twitter because of the ways Elon has messed with Twitter. That's all true. I don't deny any of that. It gives me no real pleasure to say that, unfortunately, there's a lot wrong with Blue Sky. And a lot of what's wrong with Blue Sky is closely related to the community there's frankly obsessive and unhealthy and monolithic relationship with Twitter, which it has in no way forgotten about, and in fact is more preoccupied with than probably anyone else, including people who use Twitter daily. I'm going to try to characterize, I understand everyone's feed is different. I understand maybe it's because of who I follow, though I think I largely follow the same people I used to follow for years on Twitter, and I can kind of see how the site has changed a lot of them. I'm also going to be careful not to name names for the most part, because I don't want to put anyone on blast. I don't want to pick a fight with anyone. And I do think I'm describing a more general tendency here that many other people have observed as well, whether they use the site regularly or not. Let me start by saying, why was Twitter good? Why was Twitter good to the extent it was? It was obviously addictive. It obviously pushed us toward rage and invective and unfact-checked comments that, journalists shouldn't post and so on. There was obviously a lot wrong with Twitter. But what was so magical about it in the pre-Elon era? What is it that some of us are still clinging to, even if it's degraded? I think the answer is a hard one for Blue Sky, both the most active user base and the people running the site to accept. It runs against their instincts, and actually it runs against a lot of people's instincts, maybe even mine. Twitter was not designed to be what it was. The people who set up Twitter, were sort of standard liberal/libertarian Silicon Valley guys who, weren't thinking too hard about this, and it kind of took on a life of its own.
Yeah,
right?
No, I mean, the original conceit of it was a way to send text messages without using SMS.
Right.
Twitter, so it's of the major social media sites, it's the only one where like the original idea of it had nothing to do with what it became, whereas like Facebook is sort of like more or less what it was in 2004.
Right. We all know what Mark Zuckerberg wants. He wants the entire world to put its personal data in one place so he can use it to sell advertisements and other nefarious things. That's straightforward. And, that's kind of what a lot of social media sites are essentially trying to do. Twitter really wasn't. Twitter was never quite profitable because no one knew what the point of Twitter was as a business proposition. But what it became for a lot of its power users was something that happened kind of organically, a network effect that happened organically, and that while I may have simplistically referred to it as the commons, in some way, it's not literally the commons, obviously, then or now, but it reflected the commons in some way. It reflected this idea of a universal clearinghouse for ideas and discussion and arguments that literally anyone could, there was essentially no barrier to entry. While not everyone would develop a large platform there, and obviously you had an advantage if you went in already rich or famous or well-connected, pretty much anyone could, in theory, through the force of their quippiness or their shrewd observations or whatever, make a name for themselves on this site. I mean, some people might be likelier to than others, but it was like wildly democratic in that way. And there was something universally or very, very widely attractive about that. And it drew in everybody, right? And something that people were calling Twitter long before Elon Musk took over was the hell site, or variations on that, right?
Yes.
Now, why did people call it the hell site? They called it the hell site because everyone who was there all the time saw that it was possible, no matter who you were, to get dogpiled and have everyone screaming at you. But why was that possible? That was possible because all tendencies were there. It wasn't just one tendency that was there. It was all tendencies. There were Nazis on pre-Elon Twitter. In fact, there were a lot, and people complained about them and tried to come up with moderation for them all the time. I blocked thousands of them because I got put on blast by like Mike Cernovich at some point, and I had to just block, and blocking was a very important tool. It was a site where if Megan McArdle, to name a prominent, annoying libertarian writer with 2 brain cells, if she said something stupid on that site, you could personally tell Megan McArdle it was stupid as a liberal or a leftist, and then lots of other people could, and everyone would yell at her for a day, and maybe some of her friends would come to her defense. Now, is this a healthy thing? Is this necessarily the way the world should work? Maybe not. But you're lying if you don't understand that that was like part of the appeal. And crucially, part of the appeal was that Megan McArdle was there. You shared a site with Megan McArdle. She wanted to be there for the same reason you wanted to be there, to discourse, to get her message out in the world, maybe to take a shot at me and make me, the leftist, look like the idiot that day, right? We were all there. The libertarians were there. The fascists were there. The radical trans activists were there. The DSA Bernie bros were there. The K-Hive libs were there. Everybody.
Right, okay. So what you're saying is Blue Sky has like 2 tendencies as opposed to 1,000 tendencies. And those
I would say Blue Sky has
one
one tendency that people subscribe to greater or lesser extents. I would say that the organizing principle, so the first adapters of Blue Sky were a self-selecting group of people. They were essentially the people who found Elon's takeover of Twitter most intolerable. Now, they were right to find Elon's takeover of Twitter intolerable, or at least really, really horrible. But the selection bias for who's going to get to the site first are the people who feel most passionately about that. And those people ended up having, I think, a lot of influence over the site's creators and the the site was also explicitly created to be the kind of like, wholesome, safe, not Nazi Twitter.
I mean, in some ways, it originated within Twitter. Like Twitter, the company provided the seed money for it. It sort of split off. It was like the idea originally was not here's a ecosystem for people scared of Twitter who want to flee. It was like here's sort of a more open source or protocol, if that's the correct term, based thing that sort of anyone can use as opposed to being like one central thing.
But very, very quickly, it became the clear appeal of it became to a sort of a anti-Elon Twitter alternative. So at a very basic level, I think one problem that's baked into Blue Sky is it is defined entirely in terms of Twitter and entirely downstream of Twitter.
I've said this before, there's no reason why anyone would be on Blue Sky if they weren't previously on Twitter. But I mean, we can talk about this for 10 hours. Like the world has moved on past text-based microblogging social media sites. Like everyone's on TikTok now. I'm not because I'm afraid of it. But like in a way, this is like a remnant. Like Blue Sky is like the remnant of the remnant. Like here's something that had its moment. The world has moved past it largely. And then Blue Sky is like the defectors from this. So there's a tweet, actually, I think it's from what was that guy's Kelsey Atherton? Is that his name?
Yeah, he's a friend.
He said something like Blue Sky is like the people who like fled the dictatorship, and every day they read the newspapers about like when when the diaspora is going to like regain power or something, and all talk about.
I'm pretty sure he came up with that formulation in the group chat I'm in.
Okay, yeah. So it's like the Cuban exiles in Miami who all they can talk about is what's happening in Cuba, and so that makes sense.
So here's what I'll say. On one level, of course, I accept the premise that if you just go by raw numbers and maybe long-term business incentives, that yes, text-based social media is obviously rapidly giving way to streaming, and we're moving toward a post-literate society. I mean, that could be a whole episode in itself. But that said, I think that people are counting out the importance of Twitter a little too much, especially with that emphasis on raw numbers. As someone who actually is using Twitter, I mean, some of the things that Blue Sky people are upset about, actually, from the perspective of, I am a journalist, I am someone who keeps up with media and current events and tries to make sense of them. And I am someone writing a book about the right and engaging with other people who do that, other, smart people on the left who write about the right, people like Sam Adler-Bell and Matt Sitman or John Gans, or take your pick, right? Like, who are all active on Twitter. Last I checked, it's not just like random Nazi blue check accounts on the site. I mean, they're tedious and unpleasant, but like, do you know how many prominent people in the conservative movement and the Trump administration just post their unvarnished thoughts directly to Twitter every day? Like, what, I'm supposed to not look at that, or I'm supposed to get
right?
it
So
secondhand?
if you're a journalist, especially one covering the right, it makes sense in the way that, if you're
Well, not just covering the right, but how about covering the people who run the United States government?
right, yeah, they
Right?
one and the same, and that's where they post. Like Trump posts on Truth Social. Like none of these other people post on Truth Social. They're on Twitter.
Trump himself is sui generis and posts his missives that then get copied everywhere else. But JD
But
Vance,
also, if you were a
JD
journalist,
Vance, Stephen Miller, these guys actually use Twitter.
yeah, if you were a journalist covering horse racing, like you need to hang out at the racetrack, and
Yeah.
there's some disreputable types who are going to be hanging around at racetrack as well, and you might be associating with them,
Yeah,
and
so
sharing jokes
so
with
what?
them or something like that.
So a point I made when I started getting into it with people stupidly on Blue Sky, okay, so I mean, well, first of all, tell me if you think I'm caricaturing here. If you criticize Blue Sky or say I'm still on Twitter and I can defend still being on Twitter calmly, politely, if you post that and people notice it on Blue Sky, is it fair to say you will get a massive dogpiling, all of which are basically variations on the following theme? You want to hang out at the Nazi bar.
Yeah.
You are turning into a Nazi because you hang out at the Nazi bar. You like CSAM, that is like child sexual abuse material, because Elon has not totally, has not banned Grok's ability to generate that, which means, you personally like to spend all day becoming a Nazi, marinating in child porn, and not,
it's tedious.
It's not just tedious. I think it fundamentally does not describe the reality that I experience being on Twitter. And the overwhelming majority of people saying it actually, like, many of them will say explicitly, we're not on Twitter, so they actually have no idea what they're talking about.
Okay, so
the
diaspora community in exile makes a lot of sense in this metaphor, where it's like,
Believe me, Kelsey and I have talked about this topic a lot.
So
not
someone who lives in Cuba and is forced to deal with the Cuban regime, comes to stop over in Miami, and he's like, guys, what you're doing here is a fucking joke. Like, the real action is over in Cuba. Like, the Miami exiles are not going to take kindly to that. I mean,
that person, and also, I mean, it's a nuanced thing, because on the one hand, the Miami exiles might be fundamentally accurate. Cuba is a police state. And at the same time, they probably say all kinds of crazy, unhinged things about Cuba and about what it's like to actually live there that are totally uninformed by the real experiences of people who live there now.
Yeah. They've created diaspora communities often create a mind palace version of what the old town, the old city, the old country is actually like.
Well, and they constitute their whole collective identity around hyping each other up about how bad it is in increasingly over the top ways.
But that's what happens on any social media site. So I just want to
it is, but on Twitter you'd get pushback from another community, and on Blue Sky they will bully anyone off the site immediately if they act this way, which means that anyone who is not of this, not just left or liberal, but the precise kind of sanctimonious affect that dominates Blue Sky, that's very specific and is like a fraction of left liberalism, anyone who does not fit that gets like mass blocked. I've apparently been blocked thousands of times.
Well, that makes sense. You insulted the.
Okay, but remember how I said earlier that people would call Twitter a hell site?
Yeah. So the one thing that it's easier.
If I were to go on Twitter right now,
it's easier to block on Blue Sky. There's also these ways
it's
that
not
people
just that it's easier to block. It's like, imagine if
blocking is considered a virtue on Blue Sky. That's one of the big differences between Blue Sky and Twitter. And I talked about this in an episode I did with Phoebe Maltz-Bovey more than a year ago. On Twitter, if someone blocked you, that meant that you won. You showed that they're a pussy. They couldn't take the heat, like they couldn't deal with your shit anymore. I was blocked by dozens of people whose names you recognized during my little stinker phase on Twitter, and I wore it as a badge of honor of being like, yeah, the guy who runs the Federalist blocked me. Charlie Daniels, whoever runs his account after he died, blocked me. I was blocked by someone who isn't even alive anymore. Blue Sky is the reverse. Blue Sky is blocking is righteous. You know, if someone comes into this community who does not share this community's values, like for example, Jesse Singal or
Yeah.
Barry Weiss or
Mhm.
JD Vance,
Barry would never, I think, join, but Jesse Singal I know has,
you know, we will block
yeah.
them. And the fact that 25,000 people block them, and there's this website where you can see who is the most blocked person.
Yep.
So it's like, let's make them number one. So it's different values.
There's
I
also
don't think one is necessarily better than the other. They're both
there's also a
stupid
way
and
you
bad.
can effectively like slap a label on someone's account without their
Yeah,
consent
so
or
you can
knowledge.
say this person is, you know, anti-trans, this person is
Yeah,
a Zionist, this person is whatever.
There may very well be people who look at my Blue Sky account through one of these filters and it tells them like CSAM enthusiast. And like I'm just making that up, but like someone may have done that to me. I wouldn't know. And it's a site where that happens and where that's popular and people encourage it, which I think is pretty messed up.
Right.
But also like, okay, if I go on Blue Sky and say, hey, I think this place is kind of an echo chamber, people are going to yell at me and call me a Nazi for days. If I were to,
and they're all going to say it in the same way, which I mean, it is an echo chamber, but all these things are in various ways.
They're not exactly going to prove me wrong, though I understand it's selection bias, but whatever. But if I were to right now go on Twitter and I were to tweet, Elon Musk is a Nazi pedophile and this site is crawling with like, you know, psychotic little racists and I hate it and it's hell here, I would get a bunch of likes and maybe someone randomly in my mentions would say, fuck you. And that would be it.
Right.
Because
but
Twitter, so like on Twitter, I understand
Twitter, but Twitter had self-hatred. Like you said, it was the hell site. It had self-hatred, like baked
well, because
very
people's
early
identity wasn't actually we're on Twitter. People's identity was
it became more and more as time went on.
But people's identity was what they brought to Twitter. I was there as a like left Twitter guy, right? I was there to engage with everyone.
You were there as a Twitter guy.
Left. People on Blue Sky are proud. Like their whole identity is that they're Blue Sky people. And if you come there and you insult or are not totally cool with Blue Sky people, they want you out of what's essentially their giant tedious group chat that everybody outside the chat thinks is stupid.
Okay, well, let me say how I view these things, which is, like I said, I realized that I had an addictive relationship with Twitter, and I did things to limit that over the years. One was making my account private so I couldn't go viral. And also I couldn't like get into arguments with strangers, which is, you know, kind of like getting into arguments with strangers is the main thing that people do on social media. And I took it off my phone and I did other things that sort of like making it harder for me to use this site that I realized like I was just using both out of habit, addiction, and wasn't really getting much out of anymore. And so then when I quit after the election, I wasn't going cold turkey in a way. And then I went on to Blue Sky. So the way I understand it is Twitter is heroin, Blue Sky is methadone. Twitter is, we had a lot of great times on Twitter. I had fun. I made actual friends. I made professional connections. Like half of the people I've had on this podcast, like I knew them through Twitter.
Yeah.
There was additional downsides, you know, helped elect Donald Trump twice, et cetera, et cetera.
I think
drove a lot of people insane
for that.
But anyway, so I view Blue Sky as like it satisfies the craving, but it doesn't get me high. And so I've accepted I'm not going to have a lot of fun on Blue Sky. Like fun period is over. Like the period in which we had fun on the computers seems to be largely to have passed. And I'm just like using this to scratch the itch that like Twitter created within me. And so when you're saying like, so from that perspective, you're like talking to someone who's working the program and effectively sober, saying like, but we're still having fun on heroin. Like, don't you remember heroin?
So,
like,
okay.
It was great.
To extend this analogy, I would say to the extent Twitter is heroin, my methadone, and I would recommend this methadone to anyone, though obviously it's easier said than done for some people, is a private group chat, which I've alluded to a few times. I'm not going to get into it.
With it, you mean like using within Twitter or
no. We use a Slack, but you could use a Discord or whatever platform you prefer. You could use a WhatsApp chat. I mean, that's technically Meta, but whatever. The Signal chat. There's all kinds of ways you could do it. But be in a group chat with, let's say, 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 people who largely share the same values and the same interests. And among other things, that's where if somebody tweets something like stupid on Twitter now, who's like, you know, one of our fixations, rather than do a QT and dunk on that person, much of the time I'll just take their tweet, drop it in the group chat. We'll all make fun of it in there. We all have the fun of dunking on it. We say things that are spicier than we could have said in public, and that person never knows and is never harmed.
Right. Okay. So that sounds more like you're in a recovery meeting, a group that you check in with
Well,
daily or
but
something, and you all reaffirm each other's.
well,
Like,
but it's
okay,
not. I don't do it with.
I will not dunk. I will not be
Yeah,
main
but it's not.
character.
I don't think the reason it's not like AA or whatever is that it's not like a group of random people who are there to fight their Twitter addiction. These are people I know in real life, or I
Right.
knew on Twitter, or were like regular interlocutors. These are like media networks that exist informally. Like, and I hear about lots of other ones that I'm not in, but maybe a
Right.
friend of mine
And
is
so I
in.
think group
Like,
chats are generally good, but like all these things, there's a negative use for them. And, the January 6 rioters plan things in Facebook
sure.
private groups. And, so it's a tool that has a positive, negative valence,
I
but
mean,
you're
to some
still,
extent, like with any, I mean, we could say that of any communications medium, right? Like on some
yes,
level, it's like telephones are good when good people use them, but they're bad when bad people use them. I
yes,
mean,
yes,
that's kind of how I
exactly.
feel about any of these things,
Oh,
right?
but like, okay, but looking back on it, like, was like, what was Twitter ever really good for? It was like fun. Another way I thought about it is like, for a while, it sort of seemed like being on Twitter was like, driving on the road or something, or like drinking water. It was almost became like a utility of the internet that seemed like it was for everyone. And because the site was so poorly managed at the corporate level, it sort of just seemed like this is sort of a neutral platform, like maybe Wikipedia is or something, even though Wikipedia is its own self-police platform. But yeah, it had this appearance of a utility or the public square or something. But like, what were we actually all doing on there? Once Elon Musk bought the site, it became clear that we were like creating value for this company and creating like a network of users and influence and stuff that an evil person could purchase and use for his own ends, which
Yeah,
involved getting Trump elected and dismantling USAID. Um,
sure.
so
So I take that seriously to an extent, though, on the issue of creating value. Admittedly, I haven't checked recently, but at least for a while, it seemed pretty clear that Elon actually burned a lot of money, actually a lot of other investors' money, acquiring the site, and still has no idea how to make it profitable
right. But
because it can't
in
be.
the way that Marty Peretz couldn't make the New Republic profitable, like he sees it as part of his project to continue to control
Right.
it.
Right. So that in some ways, that's actually the better analogy. Marty Peretz was able to wield influence by funneling money into this, money losing but very influential magazine. But then I would say, well, did we read the magazine? Did lots of people we respect write for and take salaries from the magazine? Well, they did, because you know why they did? Because for better or worse, often worse, it was part of the discourse. It was part of where ideas were shaped in the public space. And for better or worse, very plausibly worse, so is Twitter, both pre and post Elon. The reason I'm on Twitter is not to shoot the shit with random people and make jokes about the news passively. The reason I'm on Twitter, I mean, Twitter was instrumental for me in breaking out from being a kind of, person who followed the news and commented on it to a person who participates in it, creates it. I don't want to overstate how important I am, but like Twitter turned me from a nobody into a somebody in a lot of ways. And even if I'm a minor somebody, and it's a hard thing to give up. I admit a lot of this is nostalgia. I don't know how sustainable it will be long term. All I can say is that so far, 3 or 4 years into the Elon era, Twitter remains more useful for the purposes I wanted it to be useful for than people on Blue Sky claim. And on Blue Sky, which is not, I would not say famous for its coherence, people sort of go back and forth between laughing at how irrelevant and pathetic Twitter is, and how Elon Musk blew a lot of money stupidly on this platform that doesn't matter, and they'll vacillate between that and, oh, actually he's used it to elect Donald Trump, take over the world, turn us all into Nazis, poison the minds of a generation. I'm like, well, which is it? Because those are very different things, and the fact that you might simultaneously believe they're both suggests maybe there are some nuances here you're not getting at, even if they both have elements of truth to them. And one nuance they're not getting at is that enormous numbers of people who are not Nazis continue to use this site.
Right.
It's not clear to me that, I mean, I certainly don't pay for a blue check, and I never would. I used to have one for free when the blue check actually meant the opposite of what it does now. But like, it's not clear to me at all that that I generate any monetary
Okay,
value.
but let's say, so
You
I
could say
agree.
I
I said this
legitimize
in a
it,
previous
but
episode, like
yeah.
whether I was ultimately my own actions was ultimately like a plus or a negative for Twitter's like continued existence as an ongoing concern. I have no idea. I mean, probably neutral, or no effect, no effect whatsoever. But like, if you and all of the people in your cohort and all the people who are followers of your cohort, if you all went at once, it's a collective action problem. If you all went at once to blue sky, then the culture of blue sky would change and fewer people would use Twitter, which I think would, I mean, fewer people using
Well, if
Twitter
we're talking about
before
my
Musk.
friends in cohort, most of us have joined Blue Sky. Most people of like my exact type have with my exact values have joined Blue Sky.
Right. Well, the joke that I've been making is that the key person in this is Felix Biederman. And if Felix Biederman deleted his Twitter and joined Blue Sky, then like the entire cohort would move over.
Yeah.
It is an influencer economy in various ways. And if there were, if on TikTok, like the top 50 TikTok creators move to, some knockoff site, like it would take a chunk out of TikTok as well.
Yeah, but
But
one thing I'll say about the culture of what I guess you could call influencing is, well, I won't deny that Felix or I or anyone with a Felix more than me or anyone with a certain like following and a certain monetizable following in his case, I won't deny that they are broadly influencers. There's something about the concept of influencer that implies and often in practice is very mercenary, where like you just go where the followers and the monetizing opportunities are, and you're like very self-consciously like professionally there to sort of milk that. And there are a lot of people in many different genres that behave that way. But one thing I like about Chapo, and that I try to do myself, and that I think a lot of the people I like to read or listen to do, is I try to keep it pretty real. I try to be my authentic self. I mean, I'm not saying I'm not performing to a certain extent, but like I haven't really monetized or gotten rich off any of this. I really am doing it because I want to get my ideas out there. I want to be in the mix. I want to engage with people. And this is a format in which I think I'm pretty effective doing that.
But whether you're directly monetizing or not, like
No, I understand.
there's a form of influence that being a Twitter account with 20,000 followers or whatever once gave you.
Sure, more than that.
If you deleted your account and left entirely, like you would be losing something not, losing something semi-tangible.
I would be losing something semi-tangible that matters to me, and it's not money. It's reach, and it's community. It's a sense of being on the radar of. I mean, I still get commissions and editors out of Twitter, believe it or not. So it's still, and I still get like tips and people who want to make contact with me, and then we switch to phone or whatever. Like that still happens pretty regularly there. But also, like, I don't want to speak for Felix or Will Menaker or any of those guys in Chapo. I know them a little bit, but I certainly can't speak for them. But I do get the sense like the reason they're still on Twitter is not for money, and it's which they certainly don't need and get from their podcast, and it's not because they're Nazis who like Elon, which they don't, and they're not. I think they're there because the kind of like no fucks given, ironic, maybe I'm going to offend someone a little like edgelordy posture that has been in Chapo from the beginning fits better there. I think they're there because if they were to go over to Blue Sky, which I think they nominally have, like so many people, what they would see is a place that's insufferably cringe and dull. And
it's not cool. Yeah, Blue Sky is definitely not cool.
It is the like most proudly, aggressively not cool space I have been in since like I was in middle school, and it's much bigger than that, and has the power of the internet behind it, and it just is a bad vibe, and very little of importance happens there. I mean, that would be my other case. Oh, and I would make a particular, as someone who follows and writes about international affairs, I'd make a particular case here. It is very American. It's also very white. Twitter famously has a huge Black community, outsized one historically, and Twitter is all over the world. World leaders use Twitter. Right. Palestinian refugees and people in camps are like live documenting.
Okay, but in retrospect, were these all good things? Like the way I look back on my time on Twitter, so like this was mostly bad, and like having one giant space where everyone in the world could like both share information and get mad and yell at each other, like was probably bad for the world
It may
ultimately.
very well be mad for the world, but my individual decision to post on it or not is not what's going to change that. Some sort of
Right,
collective.
but if if somehow if there was a collective action movement of all the good interesting posters and they all moved over all at once to Blue Sky or whatever
But I
whatever
guess
else,
what
then
I'm
like
saying
that
is
would
I don't. I
that
guess
would
what I'm
hurt
saying,
Twitter.
going back to my earlier point about how everyone was there, we don't just want the good, interesting posters. I mean, I think this is a fundamental conceptual disagreement I have with a
Yes.
lot of Blue Sky. I don't actually want to be on a platform that is only people who agree with me, and in fact, I don't want to be on a platform. I think one of the dangers of being on that platform is that quickly I don't agree with them because I'm too idiosyncratic, and they all start becoming more and
Right.
more.
Okay. Well, I'll just say the only thing that everyone on Blue Sky agrees with is that Twitter sucks. There's plenty of divisions that within Blue Sky you see stupid arguments, but you see plenty of, there's stupid arguments of the same sort of stupid arguments that happen on Twitter or happening on Blue Sky. Maybe you're just not seeing the cleavages. Maybe they're stupider, they're
I
less
mean,
funny
sometimes
because
what I see is that someone who was still on Twitter screenshots like some insane tweet, brings it over to Blue Sky, and then that's what they talk about all day. So
yes,
they basically just created their own Twitter chat room.
in that yeah. So
But they're still
that's the
basically a
exiled
barnacle on
that's the
Twitter.
exiled
Yeah.
thing. I mean, what do I want to say? So when I was looking for your original post that you that made everyone mad, Google brought up this post, which was actually a reply to a quote tweet. So I'm sure you can see it, but I'm going to read it to you now.
Oh
The
boy.
poster's username is XYDXX unicorn, with a unicorn hearts, trans, and gay pride flags. And they wrote, quote, Blue Sky will never be relevant, has the same energy as folks who said a furry convention would never have more than 2,500 attendees. So there's a lot of furries on Blue Sky. And
Yeah.
so there's all these people who are like not involved in this world of social media that like we think is the most important thing. Like mainly what people use social media for is they're watching TV and then they type out what they're thinking when they're watching TV. A lot of
Sure.
it's sports, where people just being like, "Can you believe that?" or like, "What a move," or like, "Oh no," or just watching a reality show or whatever. Like that is how a normal person uses social
Yeah.
media. Now this
So
furry
so
is not a normal person, but
so
for
let me
them, Blue
let me
Sky, you underestimate Blue Sky is like saying, "Oh, furries, that'll never take off."
look, I don't want to yuck their yum. If they find other like-minded furries on Blue Sky, that's wonderful for them, and I'm happy for them. I will say that though, you were like, is Twitter and like the whole world being in one place a good thing? And I said maybe not, but it's a thing regardless. But let's turn it around a little. Is social media as you just described it, which is basically regular people like live posting their idle thoughts about what they're watching on TV from their couch, is that a good thing?
Probably not. I mean, I've
Probably
been,
not.
yeah.
So what is the problem Blue Sky solves? The problem it solves, I guess, is we were on this site called Twitter, which we knew was problematic in a lot of ways, but we also got a lot of joy from. But then a Nazi took it over. So wait, but there's a solution. We can all shitpost just with people we agree with in exactly the same addictive way and get each other all riled up in exactly the same way. But now it won't be run by Nazis, and we won't let any Nazis on the site. I don't actually think that has solved a problem. I think it has created a site that is not particularly useful or interesting to me. And look, I mean, the larger rap on social media, right, is that it replaces real, meaningful human connections. Now, I have not found that to be true in my experience. I have a wife and child. I have lots of flesh and blood friends. I go to parties a lot. A lot of the people I go
You're very popular. You're well
very
liked.
popular and cool and well liked. No, I have my enemies too, but like a lot of the people I do that with are also very active on social media, but we hang out in real life too. It's also introduced me to people, I'll go to another city and there'll be someone I've always interacted with on Twitter and we end up hanging out there, and that's real. I mean, this conversation we're having now is through a screen, but it is a real conversation between two human beings who've met. And like, if ideally, if you're a furry, you should be going to a real furry convention, and I hope they all are. If you are in your room because you still think that the COVID-19 pandemic is genocidally killing millions of people a day, and you never leave your house, an opinion I see more often on Blue Sky than anywhere else in 2026, then I actually think you're doing yourself a real disservice. I mean, you're shutting yourself off from humanity. Twitter sucks for all the reasons I've said and many of the reasons Blue Sky has said. However, as someone who, like, I have a pretty unabashedly elitist take here. Like, I am not most people, right? And not just because I have like more followers or whatever, but because like my job is such as it is to write about and describe the world we live in. And in the world we live in, a lot of the most powerful and influential people are sharing their thoughts in real time on Twitter. So I'm there seeing what they're saying. I
Yeah.
wish they weren't. I wish Stephen Miller and JD Vance weren't some of the most powerful and influential people in the world, but they objectively are.
Right.
And
And Twitter
you know,
always was more of an elite thing as opposed to the other social media sites. And people who were traditional elites like journalists or politicians would use Twitter and gave it more influence than it would have naturally had
yeah,
because these are people who work with words during their life. So they it just it has all sorts of odd aspects. So as a journalist who's following various things, it makes sense to be where all these people are. That makes sense to me. But I don't know. Like if I said this in some previous episodes, like, if one could like Thanos snap one's fingers and erase all, like keep the internet, but Facebook, all social media went away, like I would do that. Like it would be a better world
sure.
back when it was
A
just
lot of people
blogs
would,
and
but you
stuff like
can't,
that.
right? Like it's literally a comic book concept, and you can't.
Right.
And
So we live in this fallen world,
we
but
live in a
I don't
fallen
know.
world.
I guess the last thing I would say this, we've gone for a long time, is,
Yeah.
like I think I overestimated how much I like felt like I was missing out on things like by not being on Twitter. And it was like Twitter was more of a thing in 2018 than it was when I quit in 2024. But like even in the last couple of years that I was on it, like it just seemed like more of this is marginal to what's happening in the world, and it wasn't as fun. We had like there weren't fun days on there like Juicero Day or Bean Dad Day, or 30 to 50 feral hogs days anymore. Like it was becoming more of a chore, and so it wasn't. Maybe I've cut myself off from various professional opportunities, future friendships, other things by leaving Twitter. But what Blue Sky provides for me is just that itch that Twitter naturally created in my brain of just like, I want to see what the latest thing is, and I want to use my thumb to scroll.
Yeah.
And I think it replaces that in a way that makes me feel both morally superior to everyone who's still on Twitter because it is owned by Elon Musk, and Nazis run rampant there. But just like, here's enough to get me by, and then I can spend more time either living my life or playing spelling bee or something like that.
Yeah, my parting thoughts, and then we both definitely should go, are, I use Twitter because it's the discourse, like the public discourse that I care about, and where, like both people I agree with and people I hate but acknowledge are very important are participating. I use my group chat to shoot the shit, create fun in-jokes, have wonderful, hilarious days, have conversations I wouldn't want to have publicly about the stuff I see on Twitter and elsewhere. I use Instagram to post locked photos of my kid and for no other reason, and to see my friends' pictures. And I don't really know what I use Blue Sky for. I mean, I use it as a place, I guess, to share links to my articles to the quarter of my Twitter following that has decamped there. And those links sometimes travel better than on Twitter, but sometimes they don't. And also, the most recent article I posted there did travel, but it also got a lot of people calling me an anti-Semite. And I guess, yeah, my final point is, I think because Blue Sky operates on this kind of obsessive, increasingly rhetorically extreme, false representation of what Twitter's like, that spreads to other topics and as well, and creates a kind of heightened unreality in general that is only reinforced. I mean, this is the danger of an echo chamber isn't that it's annoying or monotonous. The danger of an echo chamber is actually that it gradually takes over people's minds. And I will not name names, but I have seen some, like a handful of writers of some prominence and intelligence and people I have respected, I think, become worse writers and thinkers by prolonged use of Blue Sky. I will not name names. You can guess for yourself.
That can't possibly be more
No.
than the people who Twitter drove stark raving mad naked in the streets. Like
Twitter,
ruined,
no, but like
Twitter took over brains and ruined normal people's lives.
it did, and it has, but there's a but it does it in different ways and for different kinds of people.
More exciting, in like funny ways.
Well,
maybe,
no,
than-
different, like differing from each other, like not all in one monolithic way. What I see, there's some things that are basically conventional wisdom on Blue Sky that are insane, and I'm going to list like 2 or 3 examples. The first example would be the idea that I'm a Nazi and an anti-Semite, and that my Jeffrey Epstein piece you can disagree with it or think there are problems, but if you actually think, as apparently hundreds of people on Blue Sky do, that I'm a Nazi for writing that piece, and including a few, I think, intelligent writers who I think are just like, they look at that and just like signals jump off in their brain that like other people would not see. But the two that don't involve me that I always come back to, one is, look, there are a lot of reasonable things you can complain about with the New York Times, right? And I do. And I could tell you, we could do 2 hours of me talking about things that are problematic about the New York Times.
We did I don't know if you remember, we did an episode like that in like 2018 or something.
I
where we
believe
talked about
it.
the Times.
I believe it. Maybe we did. But I would say the near uniform view on Blue Sky is that the Times is a literal Nazi publication that supports Nazi Donald Trump, that everyone who works
I agree.
there
Yes,
supports
that's
Donald
insane.
Trump. That
And
is
I know who promulgates these myths, and I've talked to them, in fact, directly, and telling them that they're wrong about this. But sort of once you develop a shtick on any social media site and an audience, like, you kind of have to keep doing that.
Right. But the thing about that is, it is incorrect. It is a false representation of reality. It is a deeply misleading and mendacious representation of reality. It is empirically provably incorrect. Yet it is repeated ad nauseum. Anyone who would ever push back against it on Blue Sky would get mobbed. So no one ever does.
Okay. What I will say is I push back on this shit. And one of my, the idea that the New York Times supports Trump and wants him to flourish is wrong. And I try to point out when I see that's wrong. No, sometimes,
but I have watched
anything on
I have
social
watched
media,
seemingly intelligent people like fall deeper and deeper into the hole of believing that. And once you start believing that, you start believing other things. I mean, first of all, you've written off like half of the employed working journalists left in the industry as monsters, which I don't think is what we need right now. But also, like, once you believe that, you'll believe all kinds of bullshit. And so the other one, which was very time specific, but this was actually, I think, when I first started picking fights with Blue Sky. On Blue Sky, a very large, very vocal segment of people, including many of the most influential voices on the site, absolutely would not hear that Joe Biden was like senile and stammering through that debate with Donald Trump. It was like an article of faith that did not happen, that the New York Times and other mainstream media were lying and telling you that happened in order to elect Donald Trump. And I saw like real journalists there, and only there, because on Twitter and in my real life where I talk to real people, people of literally every persuasion could follow like the evidence of their eyes and ears. And on Blue Sky, I saw this patently absurd false consensus develop with almost no pushback. And I think that is what Blue Sky does to people. And I thought it was really embarrassing.
You make a point that I agree with, in that like Blue Sky in its echo chambery ways can lead you down like a rabbit hole or reinforce various like niche or unrealistic ideas that you like get deeper and deeper into. This is not unique to Blue Sky. Like, this is almost all of social media, is like, you watch one video about is the moon landing fake on YouTube, and then like 10 hours later you're watching stuff about the Jews controlling the globe.
I guess with Blue Sky, and I'll stop here, my complaint is, I mean, some of this is like about familiarity or who you do care about, right? Like, I understand that Facebook is taking someone's like, uncle in Arkansas and turning him into a Nazi. Like, I'm aware that that's happening. My specific grievance, and has been happening for years, my specific grievance with Blue Sky is that it is taking journalists whose work I have respected and who I like personally, and it is making them dumber and less curious about the world. And I think that's bad.
Right. I guess I would just say maybe dumber and less curious about the world in specific ways, but social media and other things related to our phone have made us all like stupider and more prone to believe things that aren't true in general. So I don't see Blue Sky as being worse than, other things that we've created, or that Silicon Valley has created, and we've participated in their popularity over the past 15 odd years. Okay, but we've been going for a very long time.
Yeah. Let's
so if people want to follow you on Twitter, Blue Sky, or elsewhere, where would you direct them?
On both, I am David Klion, just no space, no punctuation. Klion.
So a link to your social profile will be in the notes. Like I said, I'm only on Blue Sky now, and take great pride in that fact. As if people can follow me on REACW on Blue Sky, they can rate and review this episode. They can tell their friends about it. They can stop looking at their phones in general and go talk to their loved ones. Or
that would be my actual advice to everyone. Get off these platforms, go touch grass, go be a human being.
Yeah, the
But
weather's
obviously,
getting
I'm an
better.
hypocrite,
You could go
so.
to just take a walk outside. Okay, well, Dave, thanks for coming on and talking about these contentious issues with me. And thanks to all the viewers and listeners out there. And we'll see you again next time.
Always a pleasure.